Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Scrum Pulse, I think, is the cool way of describing it. Thank you for taking your time out of your day to listen to today's webinar. So we've got some slides. We're going to be talking about some stuff around APOM, the Agile Product Operating Model and evidence-based approach. And it's going to be based on actually some survey data and a little bit of analysis that we've done here at Scrum.org. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. So you know who Scrum.org is? I think you do because you're here, right? Scrum.org, the home of Scrum, helping people and teams solve complex problems. And wow, do we have some complex problems today, hey? And we do training, certification, and ongoing learning, which this would be probably an example of that. And it was founded by my boss, my good friend, Ken Schwaber, chairman of the board, Ken Schwaber. And he says hi. I actually spoke to him last week, and he says hi. Okay, so who's talking today, though? It's not just me. Gosh, fortunate for that. Hey, I'm talking. You know who I am. You don't need to read that stuff. Yeah, the CEO here at Scrum.org. But luckily, I've got somebody much smarter than me, Darrell Fernandes here, who's an advisor to Scrum.org. I've actually known Darrell, gosh, long time, 2000 and something, six or something. No, seven, I think. 2007, we met. He was working at Fidelity Investments, and I was working at Forrester Research. And it was great. We sort of hit it off and we started working together, doing some research together, sharing some stuff and some experience. And over this last 19 or so years, we've continued that relationship. And now he's here at Scrum.org. You can see some of the things he's done, CIO at Fidelity, head of product technology at TIA, and an advisor to us and some other companies, particularly PlanView, might be interested in there. And he does some fantastic mentoring. So luckily we've got Darrell here to keep me right. So all right. Um, so what we're talking about really, and the problems that we're very much focused on, is that the the reality is traditional operating models are no longer sufficient in the area of constant change and rising complexity. I think AI is kind of like amplifying this. These traditional, very broad, very deep operating models with large amounts of middle management and reporting and systems around that ultimately aren't cutting it in the digital age. They organizations now, new entries into particular markets are approaching this in a lot more product centric, flatter, thinner organizational models. Um, what's also interesting and what we've seen, and I've seen a lot of this at Scrum.org, is that we're in this sort of transformation plateau. Um, Many organizations over the last 30 years adopted something akin to Agile. They certainly did things like automated testing, incremental delivery, maybe even continuous delivery. But the way they use these practices are in quite a challenging mode. They've got the words, but the muscle memory, to use a phrase, isn't really there. And the other thing that we're seeing over and over again is this sort of in-between state that most organizations is creating an illusion of progress while actually they're not delivering value to their customers faster. They're not innovating around digital technology to deliver different value today. And that is a serious problem.
Dave, before we move on from that, if I could, I think what we've seen in this space is pretty cross industry. I think
Mm,
whether it's consumer products, whether it's retail, whether it's financial services, we've seen a lot of this problem set emerge. We've got one question specific to pharma, biotech, which is so much change happening in a broad sense in that space today. I personally haven't worked with pharma biotech but I was curious if you're seeing the same kind of challenges here in that industry sector.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing particularly, so I'm fortunate that I get to work quite a lot with a company called Dino Therapeutics, which is a biotech firm that uses machine learning and and genetic research, particularly CRISPR and other techniques like that. What could possibly go wrong? No, they're not creating the zombie plague. They're doing the exact opposite, which is really refreshing. And what I'm seeing in organizations like that are relatively new, that are growing, that what they're doing is they're applying an incredibly different operating model from a traditional pharma company. And you see this real difference. We're seeing these new entrants, particularly around technology-driven innovation, building new capsids or new protocols, etc. Really taking advantage of a different paradigm to the way they work. And then you've got big pharma, which has grown from a different space, and there's very different points of view there. So big pharma, I definitely see these problems that we're talking about, this transformation platter, that they're wrestling with this sort of in-betweeny kind of model. Whereas I'm seeing a lot of new entrants, particularly in the biotech space, but also in the robotic space. The medical robotics space, I guess that's biotech as well. All of this trying things quite differently. So there's these very different worlds that are there. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think it does. And just to draw the analogy or the corollary here, I think we saw that in financial services in the
Mm,
late 2000 knots, right? Which was, a lot of fintech startups, a lot of smaller teams able to deliver interesting products to market quickly through a different model, which is what drove us in the financial services world to think more product oriented end to end, as we're going to talk about today. So I think it's an interesting question, and I think it'll be an interesting topic for our conversation.
cool. Thank you, Darrell. So let's talk about what we decided over about the last 2 years is kind of like an approach or a solution to some of those problems, which is this thing called the Agile Product Operating Model. Many of you have already been on maybe webinars where we talked about it. We have a comprehensive collection of resources around this, but in a nutshell, just for the people that probably aren't thinking about it every day, I hope you're not. Anyway, I hope you've got much better things to think about. Broadly, it's a holistic approach, really this idea that we take the fundamental concepts of Scrum and scale it across a whole value stream. Meaning, we take those empiricism, this focus on empiricism and outcomes, this self-management, self-organization, kind of empowerment. We take continuous sort of like improvement and the mantras around this. We take the ideas of discipline. We take the ideas of customer centricity or focused on actually stakeholder centricity, I think would be a better description of it. We take those ideas and we sort of scale that across the operating model for one product. So this is a product operating model based on these principles. And, and evidence, what we found is that evidence becomes a key commodity in this operating model. So basically everything is in the context of an outcome that we perceive we want, and evidence that supports or negates that outcome. And the idea is that you align all of this around a very clear goal set to ensure that things fit together. And yes, broadly, we talk about strategy, people, structure, and obviously the thing that I spend or Scrum spends a lot of time worrying about, which is value cycle, discovery, delivery, and operate. So this APOM approach is something that's evolved. The description of it has evolved over the last sort of like 2 years. And you may have seen recently we published the guiding principles around this. So we've sort of like abstracted that and tried to do that. And a little bit of history about APOM. And the reason why I share this is because when we get into the details of the webinar, it sort of sets that context. Um, we came across APOM not because we were trying to build another scaling framework, an agile transformation framework. In fact, the exact opposite. In fact, I've kept Scrum.org out of that business. Yes, we did Nexus, which was really just a mechanism to say if you've got multiple teams working together on the same product, this is what you need to do. So it's not rocket science. But we avoided this sort of enterprise story, people like Less and Safe and Spotify model and all that stuff. They were doing their thing. But we watched it with great interest because we thought professional Scrum, the team-based approach, needs to be good and then scaling happens. So about 2.5 years ago, we saw our customers were wrestling with product ownership. And so we then introduced this product owner capability model, which is basically this is what we think product owners need to be able to do, their capabilities and the skills that need to support that. And we discovered, I spent a lot of time talking to organizations, that it wasn't a product owner problem. It's not about what it needs is an operating model for the product owners to live in. It's more holistic. The problem is more comprehensive. So we started work on this agile product operating model, and we started building content about some of the things we were seeing from companies like Dino Therapeutics and the like we mentioned earlier, some of the principles that they were following, and started to build out the materials. And we talked to lots of organizations and asked those things. And we distilled that into a series of webinars, published white papers, and created a learning series that you can go to the website and see. Um, we then built, so we were like, yeah, this is great, but we really need to, though we'd talked to lots of people, it was a little bit sort of, I don't want to say anecdotal, considering or evidence-based, but it really was. I had conversations. I then said, oh, you do this. How did that work? When doesn't it work? And built this stuff. I then decided, or we then decided that we needed to build out a survey, a deep survey that really tested these guiding principles. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about the results that we found from this survey. We published the results, and after the webinar, you'll get, with the slides, etc., links to the results, links to the guiding principles, links to the fundamental paper. So ultimately, this is kind of where we're at now. We've done quite a lot of first person research, and now we've done some surveys, and we've built out some content, which then our hypothesis is it generated these guidelines, guiding principles, as it were, are the thing that ultimately describe APOM in its completeness. So, gosh, that was a bit of a whiz through the last 2 years of my life, and lots of other things happened, including my favorite football team being relegated. But that's the APOM story, and that's where we're at today.
So Dave, just one thing to note, because you mentioned SAFe, you mentioned some other scaling frameworks, and we've got this conversation about APOM and guiding principles here. Would you say the guiding principles are intended to complement whatever
Yeah.
scaling model you're using,
So,
or go ahead?
so the answer is yes. Sorry, and I know I got a little excited then. And the reason why is because many of the companies we talked to were doing safe, really, honestly. The majority, I think I spoke to one doing less. And the what was really interesting is they were doing safe. But was it really safe? It looked, no, I don't mean that I wasn't trying to be ironic. This isn't the fault of Safe or the fault of the company. It was the fault of the implementation of those things in the context of the problems and situations and power, status, authority, and risk, how the organization dealt with risk. That was definitely a cultural thing. So what I tried to do is step back in the guiding principles. And initially, I wanted to build a guide, and literally like a Scrum guide. And I found that I couldn't do that because there were so many contradictions. But what I did find was that many of these organizations were either doing something because of this principle that they were executing, or they were aspiring to do something and failing of a principle that they had. For instance, one a very simple principle is around mapping business strategy and outcomes to clearly to product strategy. Very simple principle, right? We then, so the evidence that we gather around that is, do we see a clear traceability from things in product backlogs all the way to the actual thing, right? And does that then manifest itself in the portfolio planning? Maybe you're using the safe approach for that, LPAM or whatever it's called, Lean Agile Portfolio Planning, or and you're doing that. So most organizations are aspiring to that, but then the majority of their backlog was actually being informed by something else. So either this doesn't mean the strategy is being applied, or but they still aspired to it. So we tried to build something that allows you to judge and to sort of take a step back from all of the practices that you're currently adopting, look for the evidence that the system's providing, and see if it really does conform or deny, confirm or deny that principle. Does that answer the question, Darrell?
I think it does. And the question was really, how is APOM different than SAFe? And knowing how we got here, I
Yeah.
don't think it's different. It's more a complement to, and that's what I really wanted to get to the heart of. And I think you articulated that well.
And the thing that really disappoints me about many of the things that are in flight is that we sort of forget why. Like, for instance, in Scrum, why do we have a daily? We sort of religiously do the daily, or maybe not now, I don't know. But why do we do that? We do that because we want to inspect and adapt the progress we've made in the previous 24 hours and then help everybody come together and decide what we're doing in the next 24 hours. The practice, we can do the practice without actually fulfilling that principle. We can actually stand in a room, maybe in a circle, and say, "Oh, what do we do yesterday?" and pay no attention really to changing the future based on the experience that we had in the back. And it is interesting that even we, Scrum.org, as fabulous as we are, make that mistake as well sometimes. We sort of forget. We become so focused on the mechanics, we forget the intent. And the guiding principles is meant to describe the intent. Maybe not brilliantly in places. Apologies, I did my best, but sometimes I was overwhelmed. But yeah. Anyway, does that sort of answer?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, yeah, God, there's so much we could talk about now, Darrell, and I really appreciate you pulling me back because I do get excited. All right, so let's look at some key finding. All right, so key findings, we've got organizations adopt agile practice on a situational basis rather than. So this is from the survey. We found that we got a lot of maybe, sometimes, occasionally, oh, we'd like to. So on the adoption of certain key agile practices and principles behind that. We also found that the practices aren't the default way of approaching problems and solutions. And inconsistency is the primary barrier to maturity, leading to unpredictable outcomes. There was a and obviously we're reading into the data and that's the interpretation and maybe you're in your situation is different, but what we found was that because of this inconsistency, in terms of how things were being applied, because that they were rarely, for instance, linking, describing backlog items in terms of outcomes, for instance, then it was almost impossible to ensure the predictability. The discipline was missing. Darrell, did you have any
Yeah,
comments on the sort of key
I,
points?
I think underneath the slide in practice is so much of what we've seen as team to team adoption of Agile and the nuance that a leader, a product owner, a business partner has in their engagement in their help of the team to be successful leads to so much inconsistency based on literally based on their personal strengths because the team will fall into, and I think this is the data trap, right? Teams will fall into the principles that lean towards um, that structure that's in place instead of staying true consistently to, as you said, inspect, adapt, right, and be able to do that in the intent of the principle versus the mechanic of the principle. So I think we saw that in the data. I know we saw that in the data. I've seen that in practice. And I think it's so much because of the team to team adoption of how we've gotten to this point in industry.
So let's use an example, which was sort of something actually I got from more of a conversation than the data. Great example is, okay, so you're working incrementally and releasing incrementally. Great. Does that release actually hit customers? Oh, no, we don't do that. Okay, well, that's this why. Well, because customers don't want change, they want simplicity, blah blah. So we bang that up into release. Okay, so what happens when you releasing in, maybe use some beta group to test it, etc. Oh yeah, we do that. Great. What happens when the feedback illustrates that you need to move in a different direction? Well, and they were like, well, that doesn't tend to happen. And the question I asked was always, have you ever been working on a program where ultimately the underlying hypothesis has been challenged and found to be incorrect, meaning the broad business decision? And the majority of the answers that I got, or in this particular example, they were like, no. I said, after you've released, have you ever felt that, when you release the whole thing finally to those customers, have you actually got feedback that actually that's not quite what you wanted? And you probably could have known that earlier, but you were so fixated on delivering this thing that you'd committed to that you actually weren't dealing with feedback during the process. And they were like, yeah, probably. We've had that. Yeah. And it was just funny that that you get this sort of like, oh, well, because we want to deliver it all. And actually, what the feedback only tells us really, we're only looking for when there's problems or defects, not challenging the hypothesis and the outcomes that are driving the work. Is that a good example, do you think?
I
No?
think it is, and I think that really hits to the top finding, which is situational basis versus systemically. Because systemically, you'd be testing the hypothesis at every iteration, and you'd be validating your course, and if you need to, pivoting. And we know that doesn't happen because the business case machine, the planning machine, all of those things need to be fed. Those machines need to be fed, and so we carry forward.
And not everybody's bought in to that
Correct.
hypothesis going through the thing. Saying that though, in situational, there are examples of where you are doing that. It may be in something that's very new or very highly unknown, or where there's a large amount of uncertainty, R&D type stuff. That then we are seeing that. So it's this inconsistency, which is an interesting underlying thing that we saw. Okay. Oh, got to make sure I'm on my slide when I do that. Okay. So that drives us into these four key challenges that the data highlighted. One is the evidence gap. We just talked about that and how there seems to be missing evidence throughout the operating model or the execution, and that's not necessarily bad or good, but it is. Ultimately, the ability to challenge those assumptions and those hypotheses and drive to that outcome is spotty and inconsistent. The second one is the portfolio chaos at scale. What we do see over and over again is, well, a couple of things. One, that the portfolio planning process is a little bit of a pantomime to some extent, and the real decision making is sort of almost outside of that process to some extent. And then the other thing that we're seeing is a lot of the work and the connection between the real work and the portfolio is a little bit transient at times, and that can be challenging. The missing middle, the fact that the middle management and that side are not necessarily aligned they're executing the process. They're executing actually two processes, the agile one and the traditional one at the same time. And sometimes that it leads them in a very difficult position. And that we still get paid, the fourth one, we still get paid on delivering work, not delivering value. And if push comes to shove, we would rather deliver something that adds very little value, but we've delivered it rather than actually delivering that value, particularly if it means not delivering something and making a choice to step back, that sort of fallacy of sunk cost kind of thing. Darrell, you got anything to add to the challenges?
Well, I think we've got plenty to add with each of them as we dig a little deeper
Oh,
here,
yes.
Dave.
Yeah, would help if I remembered that we actually go into detail for each one of these. Not that Darrell created these slides, and I'm just running on his coattails, as it were. Okay, let's talk about the evidence gap then, Darrell, shall we? Weak empiricism, yeah. We had here 28.7 decisions are only half only half evidence based. That's good. I love that. Uh, that I'm a doctor going into it's you go into a doctor's surgery and they're like, I've got this cough. Well, I'm not. I'm ignoring the cough. I'm going to concentrate on something completely different. But I've got a cough. Um, that's a little bit worrying. Um, 22% rarely use evidence, relying instead on opinions and assumptions. I'm not saying that opinions and assumptions are necessarily bad always. Some of my greatest work has been based on that. However, it's really nice if we can build evidence as well. Experimentation, the last one, is kind of missing from a lot of organizations. So basically, we go straight into building stuff. We make those assumptions and we run with it rather than building out some experiments to test the assumptions and to balance our choices.
I think there's a lesson here too, Dave. And again, financial services, we saw this with the fintechs and how we had to compete in that arena. But there's a lesson here in how do you get small, if you will, and how do you learn from those organizations that are operating with a smaller footprint. And one of the things that you look at in that space and startups specifically is the notion of how startups kind of maintain their funding, how they kind of work towards objectives, right? And so when a team is clear about what the OKRs, the objectives, the key results are, I think it forces this data conversations, this evidence conversation to a different level. And I think in a lot of large enterprises, that discipline is sometimes fogged over in the grand scheme of
Hmm.
opinions and the innovation theater concept here, which gets in the way of a conversation we'll have later, but gets in the way of that value focus because so many of these non-data driven objectives become the primaries, and we lose sight of what the real value we're adding to the enterprise is. And that value could come in a cost saving initiative, an efficiency initiative, could come in sales and revenue growth. There's so many, could come in risk mitigation. There's so many ways to define value. But if we aren't clear about what the objective is, and then we're not measuring progress against that objective, it becomes really challenging to stay on target. And that's what we saw in the survey.
Hmm. And it's funny how easy it is to fall into this trap or this challenge. Because so I'm, for instance, at the moment, I'm helping my boys. They go to both my boys have language-based learning disabilities. They're both dyslexic, and they go to a special school for that. And I'm working with this school, the Carroll School, on helping them improve their parent-teacher conference experience. It's an amazing experience. It's just incredibly hard to implement. It's just too big at the moment. So they said, well, we need to improve it, and they found out I did Scrum. Don't ask how. I guess it's my email address. And they said, could you come and help us do this? And the first thing, so it was improve parent teacher conferences. That was the objective. I'm like, what's that? That's not an objective. So we spent a bit of time building a series of OKRs, but a goal ultimately that drove actually an objective around reducing the overhead that the teachers have to invest in each thing because it was taking almost a week of effort for each teacher on top of their other jobs. So obviously that was causing some problems, and so we've very much focused on that goal, and that changed the work we were doing. Originally, we were doing a lot of work on templating and stuff. And in fact, what we did was we removed a lot of that work, got rid of some of those templates instead of that, which we wouldn't have necessarily done if we'd have just said improve parent-teacher conferences. If you're interested in my point, there's a podcast we did with the product owner, a fabulous teacher at the Carroll School that you might want to listen to as well. But and it was so easy to fall into that trap. I even found myself doing it, and then I was like, "Well, hang on a minute, why are we doing this again?" And luckily, we took that moment, and the team is an amazing bunch of educators at the Carroll School that helped me really build those goals, which is invaluable when you're making these decisions about what work you're doing. Okay, the
Excellent.
evidence gap. Shall we move on to portfolio chaos at scale? I love this. Sorry, Darrell. When you wrote this, okay, I'm now admitting that Darrell wrote these slides. I love that and the report. I love that because it just made me think of the what I see in most organizations. There's a sort of level, and most PMOs, God love them, are dealing with this every day, right? This sort of at scale. It was funny that portfolio management and planning scored the lowest across all the metrics in terms of its effectiveness. And and dependencies and coordination was definitely a serious problem. So what we found is that a lot of teams were optimizing locally at the expense of the enterprise. So that was duplicated work, conflicting roadmap items, and they because they were measuring on work as well, these teams were very focused on delivering work, right? So you ended up with this sort of kind of mess that was, or chaos, I guess. This is why you use that word, Darrell, that then management, middle management, project management, product management had to then resolve.
Well, and it doesn't help the team, right? So again, we know there's so much happening at the team level that cloud of portfolio kind of at the top of the house without clear direction. It's the reality. Understood. Businesses operate in multiple spaces. They have their own internal kind of machinery that needs to get satiated. But the fact that the team can't look up the tree and see what's important because it wasn't managed that way at the portfolio level and it wasn't clear. And again, I can use an example where within my own career, two versions of a balance calculation, a customer balance calculation, emerged through different channels, and candidly, because they were timed differently, didn't always produce the same results consistently. Not
Yeah,
materially different on a customer side, but material enough that it and costly enough that it didn't make sense to have that
yeah.
going forward. But because we hadn't productized, because we hadn't put this construct in place to allow us to focus, you have these things happening, especially around the cross team interdependencies and not being clear about where we want teams to work together and where we want discrete ownership. And those lines are different in every company. And every there's reasons to get to market, there's reasons to drive efficiencies that you make different decisions about how isolated you keep a product, but you have to be transparent, you have to be intentional about that. And I really, that coordination failure is such a big one that drags portfolios down, because the time isn't taking to be intentional about where you're going to do things either differently and discreetly or in a more efficient way. It's just such a big one for me, and such something I've seen so many times in my career that causes challenge.
And what's interesting about this is there's two dimensions. And by the way, if you're interested in this particular topic, we did a webinar, I don't know, months ago, last year, I guess, on product portfolio planning. And there was two things that there was a lot of things that came out of that webinar, but two things jump to mind now. One is the how organizations have defined their products. What we found in the survey is that everybody said, "Yeah, we're product. We're doing product. We have a product operating model. We're in products. Yeah, products are great." But then, I am the online mobile product. I am the back end web product. I'm like, what the heck? So what we've found is, yes, organizations are adopting a product model. However, how the products are defined is not necessarily supportive of both the legacy systems that are underlying these products and also the number of dependencies across product for getting any real value to customers around their value stream, not our value stream.
Right.
So one is product definition. And the other problem that we saw over and over again, and we got this in the portfolio thing, is the amount of cross-product initiatives was massive. And because of that, every product team was kind of working in a different product team that was around an initiative. And so you ended up not optimizing the product and for the value that that product was ultimately focused on. You were optimizing value for the cross product thing that we're doing. And that, and what ended up happening is that neither were really valuable at all. And it all was just a bunch of features that were being delivered. And nobody really knew why they were doing that because there's just so many pulls on these poor teams that were at the heart of that. And so that led to chaos, particularly the dependencies and you ended up not knowing whether we should build it, they should build it, et cetera, et cetera. So portfolio planning is something that I think most organizations could take a step back from and take a moment to look at some of the principles, maybe in the guiding principles document, or just maybe listen to the webinar, but just simplify it, make it so much easier than what most organizations do. And then the last point around this, I just want to share, and Darrell's going, God, he does go on about this, but is that one of the things that it smelt of when we talk to these organizations and saw this in the data is that people don't like making decisions around choices. So all of these cross-port product initiatives, we're going to go product centric. We're going to empower teams to deliver value to their clear customers that are defined by the value stream for that product. Oh, but we don't want to not do these other things as well. So we're going to do product centric, but we're also going to have these 27 cross-product initiatives as well. And that just ends up nobody is good. Everybody's in a mess. You have to make some choices. And I know that's hard. And sometimes that sort of like means your head is raised above the trench, as it were, an opportunity to be shot at. But you have to make these choices. Okay, so and I know I'm conscious of time. Let's move on to the missing middle. We often talk about the middle as, middle management, the PMOs, the sort of like the things that connect the top to the bottom. I guess that's what a middle is, right? Otherwise, I'd just be feet and a head, wouldn't I? So that bit in the middle. And so there seems to be a disconnect between the product-centric goals and the way in which they were being implemented across the organization, particularly in the middle. And I think this just highlights the most important lesson that I learned from the years and years that I've been trying to help people deliver products just a little bit better, which is that middle managers are where the opportunity really lies. And I must admit, we probably failed here at Scrum.org because, we didn't highlight that Scrum Masters and product owners ultimately are middle managers, right? And that we need to empower them and give them the authority and status and support to effectively take advantage of product centricity to deliver more value. Because what we're seeing is you've got these sort of like two almost opposing organizational constructs running at parallel. We've got this product organization, this product operating model with clear authority around delivery management or scrum mastery and product management or product ownership. And then you've got this separate organization where you've got these hierarchies around skills and capabilities, and you've got managers, whether it's project managers, department managers, discipline managers, whatever, And we sort of have this tension that's created. And that ultimately means that it's very hard to shift to this empowered, aligned organizational construct. And we still see a lot of command and control. We don't see the freedom to be really to create a servant leadership. And that obviously in practical terms means, okay, so let's plan the whole release. Let's plan this. Let's have these KPIs at the start of the year for your career progression. Let's make sure we know how you're going to get promoted at the end of the year because you've been doing this job for 3 years. And let's get all of this in. And it's very different. And let's be heroes and let's be bottlenecks because that helps you get promoted in this control system. And that's kind of worrying. I mean, Darrell, you've lived
Uh,
to awesome organizations, but there's some
well, no,
challenges around this.
this is a huge one, and I think one of the things, and it's so important here, is the process and the structural change has not been mirrored in the incentive model change. We
Oh,
talked about
yeah.
this in our conversation last year, but if the incentive model doesn't keep up with the ways of working,
Yeah.
therefore, if you're not incenting team value delivery, you're incenting individual feature delivery, you're probably going to have a hard time leaping to that new operating model, right? So
Yeah.
the incentives become however they work in the organization. Could be financial, could be all kinds of different ways to drive incentives. But if the incentive has no tie to the operating model that the team is supposed to be using, it's very difficult to sustain that level of evolution. And managers are put in a very difficult position because of that, because they're driving to the incentive model to keep the team engaged through that set of vehicles that they have, while they're trying to drive towards value through the delivery model that they've got. And this tug of war that happens in that middle, it causes them to disappear on one side of that equation, and that's what we saw in the data was they could not make that leap. I believe, and we've talked about, and we've seen with actual practice, the incentive model hasn't kept up.
Yeah, I think that was something that I saw over and over again, and there were visible tangible and intangible incentives. You definitely in large financial institutions, there's a significant amount of bonus associated with certain KPIs that you run to that are defined, at the start of the year, etc. And that can contradict the decisions you're making on a sprint by sprint, product by product basis, and that challenge is there. But there's also another less visible, intangible kind of set of around promotion, sort of more intangible. How do you get promoted? How do you become, the get promoted to level 3 or whatever, associate or and the like? And those things were contradictory, and there was a cultural element to that. That hey, nobody ever gets promoted if they're too kind. You have to be a bit of a whatever, and things like that can really undermine. So incentives are a key element to that missing middle that we saw in the data, I think. Okay, the last challenge, and I know everybody's like sitting there on tenterhooks now. Value versus feature, work versus value. Um, it's funny. It's so hard not to just do the work you're told and to be focused on value. It is. It is. I know we often minimize this, and we sort of, oh, you sort of, how could you? We're the agile people. This is key. This is how could you possibly be so focused on delivering work? But the reality is, considering the thing we talked about earlier around incentives, around tangible incentives and visibility, and all these things, the fact that if you're doing stuff and your boss knows you're doing stuff, even if it's the wrong stuff, you tend to be okay. As if you're not doing stuff, even though you've told the boss that if you do the stuff, it's of no value. I think that the decisions to stop to pivot, to pull back, to change direction, all of these things, particularly if you consider the portfolio element as well, it's so hard to do in reality. It's so easy for us to say that.
Right.
But what we do is, you know, that we struggle every day on trying to make sure we're delivering the most value. I can say that from Scrum.org's point of view. I have data that shows me what the most valuable things my team should be focused on. But I would say that only about 60% of what we do is that. And the reason why is because I've made commitments that I don't really want to back out on. I've got the certain things that I just don't want to deal with the pain of me stopping things. But that's I need to do a better job there, and I'm sorry for my community and all of you that I'm not doing a better job. But it is a crucial thing, and it's so hard to implement. I mean, Darrell, you must have lived this every day.
Yeah, and there's so many factors, and I think this is cross industry. Value can sometimes take a long time to return the full metric as to
Yeah.
whether some cycles, and you see this in the education example that you've used, David, when the event happens, if it only happens 2 or 3 times a year, it's very difficult to confirm whether the value was delivered, right? So that's one big thing. There's another big thing that there's other changes happening in the industry environment that could cause value to change regardless of what the actual product delivered. So there's so many factors that can come into measuring value versus measuring work. Measuring work is easier. Let's not kid ourselves. It's easier to measure whether you delivered a feature or not than it is to measure whether that feature brought the appropriate value. That doesn't mean you should give up on value, because at the end of the day, tying that value to the objective of the product, understanding where you're trying to go with the product is so important to keep the engagement, to keep the focus, to keep people motivated to continue to deliver. You've got to look at your value through different lenses to try to mitigate those challenges that we know exist in the ecosystem, in the market environment, in the timing of value. There are ways that, and there are techniques. If you step back and ask, how do we pare down value to something that can be measured in the time frame we want to? How do we look at value outside of the market impact? Like, there's so many things you have to think through, but it's hard. It's work. It doesn't happen as naturally and easily as to look at a Jira board and say, did we deliver that feature? Yes, move on. But it's so important, and we see from the data that organizations aren't ready to take this on in so many ways right now.
So I give you a little tip that that it's quite an annoying tip. I just give you that context as well. Asking why of your leaders. So my team are definitely empowered to ask me why we're doing things, and which is very annoying. Just want to say that just for the record. And so what they do is that they basically raise a transparency of the decisions that we're making by asking over and over again in a non-annoying way, though sometimes that's a question. Why are we doing this? How does this help? How does this change that? What is this? What is the outcome? And they remind me mercilessly that we need to be very much focused on that. And I wouldn't say that we've got it perfect at Scrum.org. In fact, as I said earlier, I think we're probably 40% away from being perfect on that regard. But what I do know is that every day we strive to get better on this. And that is at least a fulfilling moment where we're like, okay, why? Why are we doing that? Why don't we stop doing this and concentrate on something else? So let's look at these recommendations. No surprise. Number one, value first. There's value in it. Um, Establish clear, measurable, business-driven outcomes. You know those cross-product initiatives that we talked about earlier that are plaguing your portfolio planning process? How about trying to align that to clear OKRs and see how when you step back, how you can maybe get some of that value that cross-product initiative wants, utilizing different opportunities within the products that serve it. That can be a really, really cool way of flipping the switch on those cross-product initiatives and driving a value-first strategy. Strategic positioning, position product development as a source of business and or service growth, not merely. So, and this is a sort of broader philosophical, sort of contradicting that paper written by Nicholas Carr in the early 90s that said IT is just a commodity, treat it in that way. Evil man, that guy. Anyway, the product development is a strategic, and in this modern world, digital capabilities are a differentiator to business value and ultimately need to be treated in that way. That means that technology and the planning of that, and it needs to connect much earlier in the life cycle of product delivery, of value delivery across the organization, and they need a higher position in that regard. The other thing is about this systemic, disciplined approach to these agile practices. I know we've been doing it for years. Aren't we bored? Yes, we all are. However, that systematicness, that discipline, that making sure that we do these things, ask these questions, update our backlogs, make sure it really can help and move us away from that transformational plateau that we are in so that we can start adopting these practices in a more consistent way. And I'm not talking about being dogmatic. I'm talking about thinking about the why, even if it's a different practice that we end up implementing, thinking about that guiding principle that we're trying to execute, and then systematically, consistently be moving towards that.
Well, and there's a question kind of that's related to this, Dave, that I just want to hit on, which is, and I think it's such an ironic situation because when I started with Agile in 1995, it was really to kind of blow up the waterfall bureaucracy. And I see so often in industry today that people refer to Agile as a set of ceremonies that have become bureaucracy. And I think it's really important to remind everyone that like professional Scrum is a framework, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, Dave,
Yeah,
but professional Scrum is a framework. It's not. It's intentionally not a methodology.
yeah,
And I think evaluating those practices, understanding the intent of those practices, understanding why you might be doing those practices within your organization versus just dogmatically saying, well, it says we have to have a daily, so let's have a daily. Why are we doing the daily? Are we getting the right value out of the daily? Do we need to revisit our daily and adapt? Those are all really important questions to ask. I don't know, Dave, do you have any thoughts on
yeah.
this notion of agile and the
I
bureaucracy that's
100%
there?
agree. One of the reasons why I didn't call the guiding principles document a framework was because of this propensity that people seem to have to take, oh, we do this and therefore we do this. That this dogma that seems to have crept into the agile community. And I know all of us are like, oh no, we can't be dogmatic, but we have to remember why we're doing stuff. At the end of the day, it's a very simple set of ideas. It's about understanding the goal that we're trying to achieve in a measurable way, breaking that goal down into small chunks of value that we can deliver to either prove that goal or deliver against that goal. We're empower teams to make effective choices along the way because we believe that decision making needs to be made in a more rapid fashion because of the complexity of the situation. Give them guardrails with things like sprint reviews and the like to ensure that you raise it to the other stakeholders so that they get input so you can rapidly make direction changes in insight and then be continuously improving the practice and the product in real time. And those things hold true. They don't change. And the people that are driving those things, the agile community that are driving those things, are the agile community I want to work with. The people that are arguing about whether it's a stand up or a daily, are sort of forgetting some of that stuff. And I think that's an important point that that agile has become that, and it's so worrying. But it is the nature of the stuff. Now, I think you should obviously still take your PSM1 though. That goes without saying.
There's one thing, Dave. I know we want to get to next steps, and I've been the one driving us forward. So, but one thing on that, I think there's an element of courage because somebody asked about what cultural steps can you take here, and I think there's an element of courage. And I'll just harken back to a moment in about 2000. five, I was working with you, so I'll challenge your dates later. But where we were trying
Oh
to
yeah.
deliver
Oh
something
yeah.
very, very quickly, very big initiative, needed a lot of business engagement, and the business had quote unquote funded it. And we said, well, we need to do this more iteratively, more agile because there's so much unknown and we need to go quick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to the business and I really believed we needed to do agile. But I went to the business and said, hey, if we're going to do this in an agile way, I need this commitment. I need these business resources available, et cetera, et cetera. And the business said, oh, our business resources write requirements and then they disappear. And I said, well, then we're not going to be able to deliver the project. And we're not going to be able to move this forward. And that was like that sent alarm bells around everywhere, right? Oh my God, somebody just said we're not going to deliver.
Mhm.
Um, and it was a lightning rod moment. And trust me, it took a little bit of courage at that point in my career. It was a lightning rod moment that created so much cultural focus and energy that if this was really important to the enterprise, that we needed to get the right focus, we needed to get the right energy. But it could have gone the other way. But the other way for me personally meant that we weren't going to be successful anyway, because if we didn't have the right business awareness, involvement, engagement, we weren't going to be able to deliver the product regardless. So I think what happens is we in the IT side of the house tend to make concessions and say, oh, we'll figure it out. Oh, we'll figure it out. Oh, we'll figure it out. And we concede to a point that we've lost the true north of what it is we're trying to achieve on a process basis to deliver value. And therefore, we end up missing the mark on both sides. So, anyway, so I made a long story
100%. That
longer.
the phrase that I hate the most is, "Oh, we'll figure this out."
Right.
Instead of having those hard conversations up front about availability of key stakeholders, about, the fact that these are assumptions and not truths, that about, and it does take some courage. So whoever said that in the chat, I 100% agree, and I really respect you bringing that up. Now, next steps, and I know we didn't have enough time for questions. I'm sorry, but when you get too talky
We've answered
cafes.
15.
Mhm.
We've answered 15.
Oh, apparently we've answered lots. Sorry, I paid no attention to that. Thank you so much for that. Anyway, these are three next steps, of course. Decide whatever you want to do, but have a look at the paper, the white paper at Scrum.org, and look in the Agile Product Operating Model using some of this data, etc. Now, the guiding principles, I've got this. If you read the blog I just wrote about this, I've been using them extensively to do all sorts of wacky things. But the best thing that I've ever used them for is to create a little survey for leaders. I just said, Oi, give me 15 questions, give me 10 questions. And using that as a mechanism, using an LLM, was just awesome because then that context that the guiding principles provided for the LLM was just awesome, and it helped me build a marking guide and helped me analyze the results and then build a little, guess what, a presentation afterwards, which was awesome. It didn't stop me thinking, but it definitely helped me do that. So that's a great use of those guiding principles, I think. Obviously, they're not perfect, but all feedback is appreciated. And then think about using some sort of APOM type approach. Think about the incentives. Think about portfolio planning. Think about how you work with partners in procurement, for instance, and the like. Those things can really help. And I know we've hit our time box. Dara, anything to leave our viewers, I guess?
I think just the one notion I would say is the guiding principles here, the framework that is professional Scrum. You don't have to do everything all at once. There are pieces to all of this that provide value, and not every organization is ready for all of it all at once. So be thoughtful and intentional about where you go, how you go, and don't lose sight of understanding your objective and understanding how you're going to measure progress towards the objective. Because the thread that we could pull all the way through here is that EBM is essential to all of this, and
Yeah.
understanding how you can measure progress towards an objective and outcome and therefore value is so important. And I think in many situations we lose sight of that.
That is very true, Dow. Well, and with that, I would like to say thank you for attending today's webinar. and you will get a copy of these slides and our inane ramblings online in 24 hours. If you have got any questions or comments, obviously you can reach out to us. You know where we're at, most of you, I'm sure, and we'll try to address them. Thanks, everybody.